The humid dawn of October 26, 1852, crept over Blackwood Manor in the South Carolina Low Country, painting the sky in pale shades of rose and gray. But the rising sun offered no comfort, only a horrifying illumination. On the manicured front lawn, where elegant garden parties were once held, a new and terrible spectacle had been arranged. It was a tableau of silent, unspeakable horror, staged with a chilling, deliberate artistry that spoke not of madness but of a profound and terrifying sanity. 13 women stood in a perfect semicircle facing the grand manor house. Before we begin, please subscribe, leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. All of them were pregnant, their bodies heavy with life, some in their final weary weeks. But their fine cotton gowns were soaked in a sticky, darkening crimson, and from the base of their sternums to the top of their pelvic bones, their bellies had been laid open with identical vertical cuts. The fruit of their wombs, the unborn children, lay on the dew-kissed grass beside each mother, small, still forms tethered by their umbilical cords like fallen anchors. And the women, they were alive. They were conscious. Their eyes were wide, not glazed with the shock of pain, but filled with a terrifying, lucid awareness. They were witnesses to their own desecration. They could not scream. Their mouths had been stitched shut with coarse black thread, the needlework neat and brutally efficient, and behind those stitches their tongues had been excised, a final absolute denial of voice. On the grand white-columned steps of his manor house, the master, Silas Blackwood, sat. He was breathing, yes, but he was a ruin of a man. In the place of his eyes, the eyes that had once surveyed his domain with casual ownership, were two hollow weeping sockets leaking a thin, watery fluid. His hands, the hands that had signed deeds, held whips, and wielded the absolute power of his station, had been severed cleanly at the wrists. The stumps were wrapped in crude bandages of torn linen already soaked through. His head moved in a slow, searching arc from side to side, a pathetic, rhythmic gesture, as if trying to see a world now permanently stolen from him. And in the center of it all, the architect of this nightmare, Elias, a slave aged 30. He stood motionless, a still point in a world of silent screaming. In his hand, he held a long, curved cane knife, its heavy blade dripping a slow, steady rhythm onto the grass. On his face was an expression that the first witnesses would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives, an expression that would haunt their sleep and turn their prayers to dust. It was not the contorted mask of rage nor the vacant stare of madness. It was something far more unsettling, a profound, absolute calm, peace. When the men from the nearby town of Port Royal arrived, summoned by a terrified house servant who had run 4 miles without stopping, they were 40 strong, a posse armed with rifles and righteous fury. But the sight that met them shattered their resolve. It broke them. A dozen of the hardiest men retched violently into the prize-winning azaleas that lined the drive. The town doctor, a man who had seen the carnage of the Mexican-American War, took one look. His face went the color of ash, and he fainted dead away, collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. Reverend Abernathy, a man who had preached on the fiery wrath of God for 30 years, fell to his knees on the gravel path and sobbed, not in prayer but in the pure, unadulterated terror of a child who has just seen the monster under his bed is real. But no one could touch Elias, because 7 of the 13 women, mutilated, bleeding, their own children lying dead at their feet, had shuffled forward, forming a protective human shield around him. Their movements were slow, agonizing, but their purpose was clear. When Sheriff Miller, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, finally raised his revolver. Leveling it at Elias's chest, it was Eleanora Blackwood, the master's own wife, who stepped forward. Her belly was open to the morning air, a gaping wound, yet she moved with a queen's grace. She raised her bloodied, trembling hands, gesturing to protect Elias, to stand between him and the law. From behind her stitched lips she forced a garbled, guttural sound, a sound of agony and effort, but the meaning was unmistakable. "You will have to kill us first." How does a man reach this point? How does a slave, a piece of property in the eyes of the law, become a figure his own victims will die to protect? Before we peel back the layers of this chilling history, a story that would become a whispered, forbidden legend in the Low Country, a tale told to frighten children and chasten the proud. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for more hidden stories from the dark corners of the past. Because this isn't just a story of vengeance. It's a story about what happens when the very definition of justice is burned to the ground and a new, terrible meaning is forged in the ashes. Now, let me take you back to where the seed of this horror was first planted. It began not with a knife, but with a piece of paper. Not with a scream, but with a smile. Spring, 1828, Charleston, South Carolina. The world then was built on rigid, unyielding lines, white and black, master and slave, free and shackled. These lines were meant to be eternal, divinely ordained. But in the cracks of this brutal, monolithic system, small pockets of exceptions existed. They were anomalies, fragile acts of defiance against the suffocating order of the South. They were flowers growing in the fissures of a concrete wall, beautiful and in constant danger of being crushed. The Vance family was one such anomaly. Hannah Vance, a woman of 32, was a living contradiction to the Southern way of life. She had been born to freed parents in Boston, a city where the air, if not entirely free, was at least breathable. Educated in a Quaker school, she saw the world with a literacy and clarity that was an impossible dream to millions. When her parents succumbed to a fever, they left her a small inheritance, a pittance by white standards, but a king's ransom for a black woman in 1815. With it, she made the perilous journey south, drawn by the dream of owning her own land, a dream her parents had whispered to her like a prayer. It was a dangerous choice. A free black person in the Deep South was a walking target, their freedom a constant affront to the established order. But Hannah was clever, her mind sharp and her will forged in the quiet resilience of her ancestors. She bought a small farm just outside Charleston, paying in cash and having the transaction witnessed and documented by a sympathetic Quaker merchant. She registered her freedom papers with the county clerk, hired a white lawyer to create triplicate copies and hid them in 3 separate locations as if they were precious jewels. In 1818, she married Samuel Vance, another free black man whose skill as a master carpenter was so profound that it granted him a grudging, conditional acceptance in white society. His hands could coax wood into forms of breathtaking beauty, and the wealthy planters of Charleston coveted his work enough to overlook the color of his skin, at least during business hours. Their daughter, Cora, was born in 1820, a bright, curious child. Their son, Elias, followed in 1822, a boy with his mother's sharp eyes and his father's steady hands. For a fleeting golden decade, they lived in a bubble of precarious normalcy. Samuel built exquisite furniture, mantelpieces, 4-poster beds, intricate credenzas for the very men who would have enslaved him without a second thought had the law not, for now, protected him. Hannah cultivated a sprawling garden of herbs and vegetables, selling her produce at the market and her remedies to both black and white families who trusted her knowledge over the town doctor's saws and leeches. At night, by the light of a single candle, Cora would read from her mother's hidden library of books, Shakespeare, the Bible, works of philosophy. Her voice a soft murmur in their small, safe home. Young Elias showed a terrifying aptitude for numbers, a mind that moved like lightning, calculating weights, measures, and costs in his head, faster than any adult with a slate and chalk. They were not safe, they knew that. Safety was an illusion. But they were together. They were a family. They were free. And in the American South of 1828, that was a miracle. Then came July 11th, 1828, a day that began with sunshine and ended in ruin. Samuel Vance was dead. A construction accident, a newly built mansion for a wealthy cotton broker. A massive oak beam not properly secured had fallen, crushing him instantly. The wealthy client, his conscience pricked just enough, paid for a simple burial but offered no other compensation. An apology, a few coins, and the Vance family was left alone, adrift in a sea of predators. And one had been watching for a very long time. Silas Blackwood was 26 years old in 1828. He had inherited the sprawling but debt-ridden Blackwood Manor 3 years prior. The plantation was a facade of wealth, its grand columns and manicured lawns hiding a foundation of crumbling loans and bad investments. Silas wanted more than wealth. He craved absolute power, a legacy that would echo through the generations. He was a gaunt man with a perpetual nervous energy and pale, watery eyes that were always measuring, always calculating the value of everything and everyone around him. He had learned one essential lesson from his cruel and successful father. The law is not a shield for the weak, but a weapon for the cunning. It existed to be bent, to be twisted to serve the will of those bold enough to manipulate it. On the evening of July 11th, just hours after Samuel's body was lowered into the ground, Silas rode to the Vance farm. With him were 3 men. They were not his usual overseers. They were professionals, slave catchers, men whose trade was the grim business of recovering property. Men who asked no questions when a white man with enough money pointed at a black person and said, "Mine." Hannah was inside trying to explain to her children that their father was not coming home. She heard the knock and a cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through her grief. There was an authority to it, a finality. She looked at her children, at 8-year-old Cora's tear-streaked face and 6-year-old Elias's wide, uncomprehending eyes. And her own grief was eclipsed by a primal, protective instinct. She walked to the small wooden chest where she kept her most important possessions, retrieved her freedom papers holding the worn parchment like a talisman, and opened the door. "Good evening," Silas said. His smile was a thin, predatory curve that did not reach his eyes. "I am terribly sorry for your loss. I am told there is also a matter of runaway property to resolve." Hannah's blood ran cold. "I am a free woman, sir." Her voice was a carefully constructed fortress of calm. "My children were born free. I have my papers to prove it." Silas extended a gloved hand. "May I?" This was the trap, a masterpiece of legal cruelty. To refuse was to admit guilt. To comply was to surrender her only weapon into the hands of the enemy. With a trembling hand, she passed him the document. Silas made a show of reading them, holding the paper up to the fading light. He squinted. He frowned. "These appear to be forgeries," he said, his tone one of feigned disappointment. "Crude ones at that. I'm afraid you'll have to come with me until we can sort this matter out properly." Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in Hannah's throat, but she forced it down. "You cannot. Those papers are filed with the county. My lawyer in Charleston, Mr. Abernathy, can attest to their authenticity." "Your lawyer?" Silas interrupted, a flicker of genuine amusement in his eyes. "Mr. Abernathy, a tragic end. Terrible gambling debts, I hear. Took his own life last week. Very sad." Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. He was dead. She had only heard the news 2 days ago. The timing was too perfect. "The county records, then?" "Ah, yes. A fire at the clerk's office. Most unfortunate." So many important documents lost, including, I'm afraid, yours. Hannah understood then. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a methodical, planned execution of her family's freedom. She looked past Silas at the three grim-faced men behind him, saw the chains they held loosely in their hands. "My children," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, conceding the battle for herself to save them. "They are freeborn. You cannot—" "Of course. They'll come with you." Silas smiled again, the picture of magnanimity. "I'm not a monster. Can't separate a family." Hannah went inside, the world tilting around her. She knelt before her children, her face a mask of desperate resolve. "Listen to me," she whispered fiercely, her fingers digging into their small shoulders. "No matter what happens, you remember who you are. Your name is Elias Vance. Your sister is Cora Vance. You were born free. Let that truth be the iron in your soul. They can take your body, but they cannot take your name. Do you hear me? Survive, endure, and you remember everything." That night, they put chains on Hannah Vance. They put chains on 8-year-old Cora, and they forced 6-year-old Elias to walk between them, his small hands clutching his mother's dress as they were led away from the only home they had ever known, into the gaping maw of Blackwood Manor. What happened over the next 3 days would not just define the next 24 years of Elias's life. It would forge the man who stood in the garden on that bloody October morning, a man for whom justice and vengeance had become one and the same. At the far edge of the Blackwood Manor property, shrouded by a dense grove of cypress trees whose gnarled branches dripped with mournful Spanish moss, sat a windowless structure known as the Breaking House. It was a place of legend among the enslaved, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful whispers. It was here that the spirits of the newly acquired were systematically dismantled, where free men were unmade, and where the memory of a life before chains was brutally scoured away. The air there felt different, heavier, charged with the memory of every scream that had ever soaked into the packed dirt floor. The building itself was a simple rectangle of rough-hewn timber with no windows, and a single heavy oak door secured by a thick iron bar. During the suffocating South Carolina summers, it became an oven. In the damp chill of winter, a freezer. This was by design. Extreme discomfort was the first tool in the process of breaking a human being. Inside there were no furnishings, only chains bolted to the walls at various heights, some for wrists, some for ankles, some for necks, a grim array of instruments for restraint. Silas Blackwood put Hannah and Cora in the Breaking House, but he put 6-year-old Elias in a small adjoining room, a lightless closet separated by a wall of thin, unfinished planks. This, too, was a deliberate cruelty. The room had been Silas's own innovation, an addition he'd ordered when he inherited the plantation. His father, a man of simple brutalities, had believed in the whip and the brand. Silas believed in the more refined torture of the mind. He remembered his father's words. Breaking a soul isn't about the whip. It's about forcing them to bear witness. A man who hears his family suffer will break more completely than a man who suffers alone. The imagination, boy, the imagination does most of the work. And so, for 2 days and 2 nights, Elias listened. His world shrank to the dimensions of that tiny pitch-black room and the sounds that bled through the thin wall. He heard his mother's voice first, strong and defiant, arguing, pleading, citing laws that no longer applied to her. He heard the sound of a slap, sharp and loud, followed by a sudden silence that was more terrifying than any noise. Then the pleas began again, but her voice was different now, stripped of its strength, filled with a desperate bargaining terror. He heard her scream, he heard his sister Cora's thin, high-pitched cries, which soon faded into a whimpering, then a hiccuping sob, and finally into a silence that was somehow worse than the screaming. Elias pressed his small body against the rough wood of the wall. His ear jammed against a crack, trying to make sense of the muffled thuds, the guttural moans, the chillingly calm and conversational tones of Silas Blackwood's voice as he explained the new reality. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the sounds of suffering. He breathed in the smell of sweat, fear, and something coppery that he didn't have a name for. He didn't cry. He sat in the darkness, a small stone-like figure, and he listened as his family was systematically unmade just a few feet away. On the evening of the second day, the door to his small room creaked open, and a sliver of lamplight cut through the darkness. Silas Blackwood crouched down, bringing his face level with the child's. His breath smelled of whiskey and satisfaction. "Do you understand now, boy?" he asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You are a slave. You were always a slave. Your mother lied to you. That is the only truth now." Elias, who had not moved or made a sound for 48 hours, slowly lifted his head. He did not look down, as a slave was taught. He did not look away. He looked directly into Silas Blackwood's pale, watery eyes. There was no fear in the boy's gaze. There was nothing a 6-year-old should have in his eyes. There was a cold, ancient stillness. The boy's voice, when it came, was not a child's voice. It was quiet, but it was unnervingly clear, each word a perfectly formed stone. "My name is Elias Vance. I was born free on May the 4th, 1822. My mother is Hannah Vance. My sister is Cora Vance. We are free." For a moment, Silas was taken aback by the boy's incredible, insane defiance. Then he smiled, a slow, cruel smile of absolute victory. He enjoyed this. This was the moment the spirit finally broke. "No," he said softly. Then he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, a pre-printed bill of sale, the blanks filled in with fresh black ink. "This paper says I purchased you, your mother, and your sister from a sugar estate in Georgia 3 days ago. It is signed and witnessed by 2 respectable gentlemen. It will be filed with the county clerk tomorrow. This is a legal document. Now tell me, boy, which is real? The paper that says you are free, which no longer exists, or this paper, which does?" In that moment, something profound and terrible clicked into place in Elias's young mind. He understood the fundamental, brutal alchemy of the world he now inhabited. Truth was not what was real. Truth was what was written and enforced by power. The person who controlled the paper controlled reality. But Silas Blackwood, in his moment of triumph, made one fatal, critical miscalculation. He let the boy see the pleasure in his eyes. He let him see the deep, personal satisfaction he took in this act of destruction. Most slaveholders cloaked their cruelty in the language of necessity, of economics, of the so-called natural order. Silas wasn't hiding. He was savoring it. And Elias, the 6-year-old boy who had just lost everything, did something extraordinary. He memorized that face. He committed every detail to a perfect photographic memory. The way Silas's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled that cruel smile, the small pale scar above his left eyebrow, the web of fine lines around his mouth. He memorized the face not with the impotent rage of a victim, but with the cold, dispassionate focus of a predator studying its prey. In that dark room, Elias did not break. He hardened. The grief and rage did not shatter him. They were compressed, superheated, and forged into something new. A weapon waiting to be aimed. 2 months later, Hannah Vance was dead. The plantation record in Silas's neat script said, "Fever." The truth was a broken body, an infected wound from a whip, and a spirit that had simply refused to continue living in a cage. Cora lasted another year. She became a ghost-like figure who moved through the plantation chores with vacant eyes, never speaking again, never making a sound until her small body finally gave out. Silas noted her passing as a minor financial loss. Elias survived. He did more than survive. He adapted. He learned the brutal calculus of his new existence. He made himself the perfect slave, quiet, efficient, obedient, invisible. He learned to bow his head, to lower his eyes, to answer "Yes, master," in a voice devoid of emotion. He was a ghost in the machine of Blackwood Manor. But in the shadows, in the secret chambers of his mind, he was studying. From 1828 until 1848, for 20 long years, Elias conducted a meticulous, patient, silent war. Working in the main house, he learned to read. He would watch the Blackwood children during their lessons, memorizing the shapes of the letters, sounding out words in his head. He would find discarded newspapers and pages from old books. And at night, in the dark of the slave quarters, he would trace the letters with his finger until they were burned into his mind. By the age of 15, he could read as well as any white man in the county. He mastered mathematics by observing the plantation's bookkeeper, a nervous, sweating man who mumbled his calculations aloud. Elias would listen, processing the numbers, understanding profit margins, crop yields, and the crushing weight of compound interest. He soon understood the finances of Blackwood Manor better than Silas himself. He became a chillingly astute student of human frailty. He learned to read the subtle language of the body, the flicker of an eye, the clenching of a fist, the barely perceptible tremor in a voice. He learned who was cruel for sport, who was weak and could be manipulated, who was secretly kind but too afraid to show it. He learned the hidden currents of desire, jealousy, and resentment that flowed beneath the placid surface of plantation life. Most of all, he studied Silas Blackwood. He became the man's shadow, his silent confessor. Silas, vain and deeply insecure, needed an audience. He would often talk at Elias while the boy polished his boots or served his brandy, boasting of his business acumen, complaining about his neighbors, revealing his deepest fears and proudest ambitions. Elias listened. He absorbed every word, every nuance, every vulnerability, and over 2 decades he built a complete, flawless psychological profile of the man who had destroyed his family. He learned that Silas's greatest pride was his pure Anglo-Saxon bloodline, his lineage that he traced back to the first English settlers. And his greatest fear was being seen as inferior by the older, more established planter families. His bloodline was his identity, it was his religion, it was the crack in his armor. In 1848, the armor began to show its weakness. A series of bad harvests and falling cotton prices brought Blackwood Manor to the brink of financial collapse. Silas was desperate. He needed to increase his assets, his stock of slaves, but he was too proud to borrow money from the very men he sought to impress. So he devised a plan for a breeding program, a cost-effective way to create new property from existing assets. He needed a stud, someone physically strong, intelligent, and most importantly, someone he believed to be utterly broken and trustworthy. He chose Elias. He summoned the 30-year-old slave to his study one evening. Elias stood before him, tall and powerfully built, his face the perfect mask of quiet obedience he had perfected over 20 years. "I have a special role for you, Elias," Silas said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I want you to produce children, strong ones. With the young women in the quarters, you will be given privileges, better food, more freedom of movement. In exchange, you will do this work diligently." Elias looked at the man who had murdered his family, stolen his life, and was now ordering him to create more property for him. and for the first time in 20 years something flickered in his eyes. It was not anger. It was a cold, predatory light. "Yes, master," he said, his voice perfectly level. "I understand." As he left the study, a smile touched Elias's lips for the first time since he was 6 years old. It was a terrible, chilling smile. Silas Blackwood had just handed him the weapon. He had just given him the key to the cage, handed to him by the jailer himself. The war was about to begin. Elias's revenge was not conceived in a flash of rage. It was an intricate, slow-growing symphony of destruction, composed over 2 decades of silent observation and refined in the cold furnace of his hatred. The role of breeder was the conductor's baton, granting him the freedom of movement and access he had so patiently waited for. He didn't just seek to kill Silas Blackwood. That was too simple, too quick. He intended to dismantle the man's entire world, to hollow out everything he valued, to turn his greatest prides into sources of unbearable shame. He would not just cut down the tree, he would poison the very soil from which it grew. His campaign unfolded in calculated stages, each step a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He didn't use force or coercion. He became a mirror, reflecting back to each of his targets their deepest, most secret longings. He saw their pain, their loneliness, their quiet desperation, and he offered them the perfect, irresistible antidote. His first subjects were the 6 enslaved women Silas had designated. To them he was not the stud, the brute assigned a task. He approached them not with lust, but with a revolutionary kindness. With Sarah, a young woman grieving the recent sale of her mother, he shared silent moments of companionship, acknowledging her pain without words. With Rebecca, a woman whose spirit had been hardened by years of brutal labor, he spoke of defiance, sharing small, stolen pieces of information about the master's financial troubles, making her feel like a co-conspirator rather than a victim. He offered them what they had never known from any man on that plantation: respect, tenderness, the profound, healing gift of being seen as human. When they became pregnant, it was not an act of submission to the master's will, but a secret shared act of humanity in a world designed to deny them of it. These 6 pregnancies were within Silas's expectations, and he was pleased with his investment. He saw only 6 new assets. He was blind to the 6 new alliances Elias had just forged. Then the true campaign began. Elias set his sights on the white women of the manor, the untouchable symbols of Silas's power and purity. Eleanora Blackwood, the master's wife, was his primary target. At 45, she was a ghost in her own home, a beautiful ornament that her husband no longer bothered to look at. Childless after 25 years of marriage, she was deemed a failure, a barren vessel. Silas treated her with a good, dismissive contempt that was more painful than any physical blow. But Elias had watched her for years. He knew she was not the fragile, faded woman she appeared to be. He had seen her in the library late at night, her face illuminated by a single candle, devouring books of philosophy, history, and poetry, books her husband deemed unsuitable for the female mind. Her sharp intellect was starving, her soul dying of loneliness. Elias didn't approach her with the clumsy flattery of a would-be lover. He offered her something far more potent, a meeting of minds. He first encountered her in the garden, a place she went to weep in private. He had been trimming the hedges. Instead of retreating as a slave should, he spoke to her, not about her sadness, but about the book she'd left on the bench, a volume of Voltaire. "To hold a pen is to be at war," he quoted quietly. "A dangerous thought in a place like this, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanora was stunned into silence. Not just that a slave could read, but that he could understand and challenge her. Their conversations began there, stolen moments in the library, the garden, the quiet corridors of the house. He debated with her, challenged her ideas, listened to her opinions with a rapt attention that made her feel more alive than she had in decades. He never complimented her beauty, he complimented her mind. He didn't offer her passion, he offered her recognition. Their affair, when it finally began 6 months later, was an afterthought, a physical manifestation of an intimacy that had already been deeply forged. She wasn't sleeping with a slave, she was connecting with the only person on earth who saw her as she truly was. Isabel Blackwood, the daughter, was an entirely different challenge. At 18, she was naive, romantic, and suffocating under her father's iron-fisted control. Her life was a gilded cage, and she dreamed of the forbidden heroes she read about in her smuggled Gothic novels. Her father had already arranged her marriage to a wealthy, boorish planter twice her age. Elias became the hero from her books. He met her in the stables where she went to ride her horse, her one small act of freedom. He didn't speak of philosophy, he spoke of adventure. He told her stories, some true, some embellished, of the world beyond the plantation, of cities where people could choose their own destiny. He listened to her dreams, her fears, her passionate, youthful rebellion against her fate. To Isabel, Elias was not a slave. He was a dark, mysterious figure who represented everything her life lacked: danger, choice, and freedom. She fell desperately, tragically in love, not with the man, but with the idea of him. Having secured the 2 pillars of Silas's dynasty, Elias expanded his campaign beyond the plantation walls. His privileges now included running errands in the nearby town of Port Royal. These trips became hunting expeditions. He identified his targets with cold precision. Elizabeth Thornton, the doctor's wife, was his next conquest. She was consumed by a quiet, respectable loneliness. Her husband was a man of science, cold and clinical, who treated her with the same detached professionalism he used on his patients. Elias met her at the town market. He didn't try to seduce her. He simply noticed the book of poetry she was carrying and commented on a particular verse. Over the next few months, he became her confidant, the only person to whom she could confess her deep, aching loneliness without fear of judgment. He made her feel seen. Rebecca Hayes, the Reverend's wife, was imprisoned by a different kind of loneliness, the suffocating burden of false piety. She was drowning in her husband's sanctimonious hypocrisy. Elias didn't offer her comfort. He offered her a shared contempt. In hushed conversations, he would subtly expose the Reverend's small cruelties and vanities, validating the secret rage she felt but dared not express. Their connection was forged in the fire of mutual disdain for the world of appearances. He made her feel righteous. Abigail Dixon, the merchant's wife, bore the physical marks of her suffering. Her husband was a violent drunk, his apologies as predictable as his rages. Elias never spoke of the bruises on her arms. Instead, he offered her moments of profound, disarming gentleness. He would help her with her heavy baskets at the market, speaking to her in a low, calm voice that was the antithesis of her husband's roar. He didn't offer her protection. He offered her peace. He made her feel safe. With each woman, the method was the same yet perfectly tailored. He identified their deepest point of suffering: intellectual starvation, romantic frustration, loneliness, moral outrage, physical fear, and he became the perfect antidote. He was a master of psychological warfare. What none of these women knew, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that for Elias, these were not relationships. They were operations. Each conversation, each shared confidence, each intimate touch was a calculated step in his plan. He was not a lover. He was an assassin, and his weapon was empathy. As each woman fell, as each pregnancy took root, He felt not a flicker of affection or remorse. He felt only the cold, satisfying click of another piece of his intricate machine falling into place. He wasn't building connections. He was gathering ammunition. He was turning his master's greatest pride, the purity and sanctity of the white woman, into the very instrument of his downfall. By the summer of 1852, all 13 women, 6 enslaved, 7 free, were pregnant. The trap was set. The symphony of destruction was approaching its final, terrible crescendo. The first dissonant note in Elias's carefully composed symphony sounded in late August of 1852. Abigail Dixon, the merchant's wife, gave birth 2 months prematurely. The child, a boy, was small but surprisingly healthy. He was also unmistakably of mixed race. His skin was a shade of rich mahogany, a stark contrast to the pale, freckled complexion of both Abigail and her husband, Thomas Dixon. The midwife who attended the birth, a pragmatic and gossipy woman, took one look at the baby's tightly curled black hair and full lips and knew. The news tore through the small, insular society of Port Royal like a fever. Thomas Dixon, a man whose public reputation was built on a foundation of blustering authority, was consumed by a private inferno of shame and rage. He beat Abigail senseless, and in her delirium of pain and fear she confessed the name, a slave from Blackwood Manor named Elias. Dixon, his honor in tatters, did not go to the sheriff. Public justice would mean public humiliation. Instead, he sought a different kind of justice. He began to speak quietly to other prominent men in town, men whose wives were also pregnant and had been acting strangely distant or guilt-ridden. He found a receptive audience. Dr. Thornton, whose wife Elizabeth had become a recluse. Reverend Hayes, whose wife Rebecca now looked at him with an unnerving, defiant glint in her eye. Within a week, a secret cabal of 5 humiliated husbands had formed. They met in the back room of Dixon's mercantile, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and impotent fury. They shared their suspicions, their fears, and the one terrible name that connected them all. "He's been with all of them," Dixon spat, his face purple. "That Blackwood stud. He's been cuckolding the whole damn town." Their immediate unified desire was for blood, a quiet trip to Blackwood Manor, a rope, a strong oak tree. But James Brenner, a shrewd lawyer among them, pointed out the flaw in their plan. "Killing him doesn't solve the problem," he said, his voice cold and rational. "It doesn't change the color of the children in our wives' bellies. It doesn't stop the whispers. In fact, a public lynching would only confirm the rumors. It makes us look like fools who couldn't control our own households." The terrible logic silenced them. They were trapped. To admit the truth was to face social and financial ruin. To hide it was to live a lie, raising another man's mixed-race child as their own. Finally, they settled on a course of action. They would confront Silas Blackwood. It was his property, his problem. He would be made to handle it, quietly, permanently, and away from public view. A few days later, the 5 men rode out to Blackwood Manor. Silas received them in his study, confused and irritated by the unscheduled visit. He offered them brandy, which they accepted with grim silence. Thomas Dixon, dispensing with all pleasantries, laid out the accusation. "Your slave, the one you call Elias," he began, "has been involved with our wives. 5 of them, all now pregnant by him." The color drained from Silas Blackwood's face, but the horror he felt was not for the dishonor of his neighbors. It was a sudden, sickening, internal lurch of absolute dread. His mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even seen before. Elias's newfound freedom of movement, his quiet confidence, the strange, knowing looks he sometimes caught from him. And then the most terrifying thoughts of all. Eleonora's late-in-life pregnancy, the one he had proudly proclaimed a miracle, a testament to his own virility, and Isabel's assault a few months prior, which she had tearfully blamed on a faceless field hand in the dark, a field hand she could never identify. "That's impossible," Silas said, the words automatic, a weak dam against a rising flood of horror. "Elias is loyal. He is obedient." "Our wives have confessed," Reverend Hayes cut in, his voice trembling with sanctimonious rage. "All of them gave the same name." Silas stood up and walked to the window, his back to his guests. He stared out at his plantation, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his entire world, his legacy, his precious bloodline cracking apart before his eyes. "I will handle this," he said, his voice a low, strangled whisper. "Leave me. I will handle it tonight." That night, Silas summoned Elias to the study. The room was dark except for a single lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the smell of spilled whiskey. "Have you been with white women in town?" Silas asked, his voice shaking. Elias stood before him, his posture relaxed, his face calm. "Yes, master." The simple, honest admission was more shocking than any denial. "You admit it?" "You asked me a question, sir. I am answering it." "How many?" Silas's voice was barely audible. "5 in the town," Elias said, his tone conversational, as if reciting a grocery list. "And your wife and your daughter." The world tilted. Silas grabbed the edge of his desk for support. "Liar," he breathed. "My wife, my daughter, they would never." "They did," Elias said, his voice dropping, losing its conversational tone and taking on a hard, metallic edge. "Willingly. And now, master, you should know why." And then Elias told him everything. He spoke not as a slave confessing, but as a judge delivering a verdict. He spoke of Hannah, Samuel, and Cora Vance. He spoke of a small farm outside Charleston and a family that had dared to be free. He spoke of the forged bill of sale, of the fire at the clerk's office, of the conveniently timed death of a lawyer. He described in vivid, excruciating detail the sounds he had heard through the thin wall of the breaking house 24 years ago. He spoke of his mother's screams and his sister's silence. He spoke of a 6-year-old boy who had memorized a face and made a vow. "You took my family," Elias said, his voice now a low, terrifying whisper that filled the room. "You took my name. You took my past and my future. You tried to unmake me. So I unmade you. I took the things you value most, your wife's fidelity, your daughter's purity, and your bloodline, that precious sacred lineage you worship. It is a lie now. It is poisoned. It is mixed with the blood of the slave child you created. The child your wife carries is not your heir. He is my son. Your legacy is me. Your family tree has been burned to the ground, and from its ashes mine has grown." For a long moment, Silas Blackwood stood frozen, his mind unable to process the sheer, diabolical scale of the revenge that had been enacted upon him. Then a raw, primal sound of pure animal rage tore from his throat. He screamed for his overseers. They burst into the room and found Silas pointing a trembling finger at the calm, unmoving slave. They dragged Elias to the breaking house, the very place where his journey into darkness had begun. They chained him to the same wall his mother had been chained to, and Silas Blackwood, for the first time in his life, personally took up a whip. He brought it down on Elias's back again and again, the blows falling in a desperate, frenzied rhythm. 50 lashes, 100, he lost count, but Elias did not scream, he did not cry out. He took every blow in silence, his body absorbing the punishment because he knew he had already won. The physical pain was an afterthought. The revenge was complete. All that remained was the final bloody act. That night, under the cold light of a waning moon, Elias broke his chains. It was not a feat of superhuman strength. He had been working on them for months, patiently, methodically filing a single link with a small piece of metal he had stolen from the blacksmith's shop. He slipped out of the breaking house, a phantom of vengeance. He did not run. His work was not finished. He went first to the great house, moving through the sleeping halls with a ghost's silence. He went to the women. One by one he woke them, a dark specter at their bedside. "Everything I told you," he whispered to a terrified Eleonora Blackwood. "Every shared confidence, every moment of understanding. It was a lie. I never cared for you. I used you. You were a tool to destroy your husband." Her face crumpled in heartbreak and horror. "Why?" she breathed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "everything ends. And you need to know the truth before it does. You need to understand your part in it." He repeated this terrible confession with each of them. With Isabel, with Elizabeth, with Rebecca, with Abigail. He shattered their illusions, their love, their trust with the cold, hard truth of his manipulation. Some wept, some raged, but Elias had counted on something more powerful than their anger, their shame, and their instinct for self-preservation. He was binding them to him with a new, unbreakable chain. "Tomorrow morning," he told each of them, "when they find us, you will have a choice. You can condemn me, tell the world the truth of how you were foolishly seduced by a slave and destroy yourselves and your families in the process. Or you can protect me, and in my silence, your secrets will remain safe." Then came the final act of his symphony. He went to the study where Silas sat in a drunken, sobbing stupor, his world in ruins. What happened next took 3 hours and was performed not with the heat of rage, but with the cold, deliberate precision of a surgeon. Elias wanted symmetry. He wanted a justice so literal, so poetic, it would be a work of art. First, he took Silas's hands, using a small saw from the woodshed. He took the hands that had signed the false bill of sale that had enslaved his family, the hands that had held the whip that had struck his mother. "These hands create truth on paper," Elias whispered as Silas screamed. "Let's see what truth they can create now." Then he took Silas's eyes. He used the sharp tip of his knife, ensuring the man remained conscious throughout. "You watched my mother suffer," Elias said, his voice calm amidst the gurgling cries. "You took pleasure in the watching. I am taking the watching away." By dawn, Silas Blackwood was alive, but he was permanently unmade, a living monument to Elias's revenge. Elias left him on the front steps, a grotesque welcome mat for the coming day. Finally, with the first light of dawn breaking, he gathered the 13 pregnant women in the garden. He performed his horrific surgery, the vertical cuts a brutal mockery of a surgeon's incision, a brand of ownership. He removed the babies, his own children, and laid them on the ground. Then he took their tongues and stitched their mouths. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was symbolism. "You used your voices to lie," he had told them, "to speak of love when you meant escape, to make promises you never meant. Now you have no voice, just like my mother had no voice when she pleaded for her life." As the sun rose, the tableau was complete. 13 silent women, 13 dead babies, 1 mutilated master, and 1 man standing in the center of it all, his vengeance finally, terribly complete. He was ready for the world to see what it had created.